All right, so now we're talking about the Japanese migrating as replacement laborers to the U.S. West as well as to Hawaii. And of course, they're working in these agribusinesses, right, which we just discussed. And that's going to be their primary occupation here as laborers for agribusiness. Now, they're seen as a solution to labor shortage. Again, we know that the Chinese were purged out of the West Coast as a political problem there, the Chinese question. But even in Hawaii, okay, and before you are some slides of the plantations there and the workers. But in Hawaii, the owners of the sugar plantations were experiencing labor shortage. Why? Because they initially tried using Chinese workers, but as we know, the Chinese were prone to return home after their contracts expired. Why? Because they saw themselves as primarily sojourners, as we know. The plantation owners even tried native Hawaiians, but as you can imagine, the natives were prone to resistance. So the Japanese were seen as the solution. Now, in comparative terms, we notice this that when it comes to Japanese migrations, you see more families coming over. And that's opposed to the so called bachelor society that we discussed earlier when it came to the Chinese. So even though the men outnumbered, and in some areas significantly outnumbered women, but you do see families, intact families actually. What they would do, the recruiters in Japan would actually go to a specific village, hire the male workers, but the male workers were allowed to bring, their families, and then that specific village, formed, this migratory flow. So, in a way, you have members from the same village going to specific regions, whether it's in Hawaii or, again, the continental United States. Okay, now when it came to settling and working, the conditions in the Hawaiian plantation system was very primitive for the worker. Okay, first of all, they're segregated by race because they do have some Chinese, like I said. But then, you have the Japanese. Eventually, you're going to see Filipinos sent, and even Puerto Ricans and Portuguese. Okay, and if you go to Hawaii today, by the way, you probably know this, right? That there's this interesting um, culture there where it mixes all the aforementioned cultures. You have some food from Filipino food, you have some Japanese, some Portuguese sausage, all that stuff. Okay, but when it came to plantation life, it's segregated by race, like I said. The sleeping quarters are not the best, unsanitary, overcrowded, no privacy. And the work itself was very regimented and unpleasant, it should be stated. You had the 5 a.m. whistle, which basically awoke in the labor crew, and then they work in these gangs. They're headed by this guy called a Luna, Luna, who's basically the supervisor. And, he was often in horseback. You can see this person here. They were known for their cruelty, their verbal abuse, physical abuse. When you're working, you can't even socialize, no talking. You can't even take stretches, or continuous breaks. So the work was quite oppressive in terms of conditions. But the tasks in the labor involved, as I mentioned, backbreaking work. You're plowing the field, you're cultivating it, and then you're, hoeing the earth, between the rows of sugar cane. You need to get rid of the weeds. You're digging ditches there for irrigation. And then once it's time to cultivate, you strip the dead leaves from the stalk. These stalks are like 12 feet high, as you can see in the picture. And then you load the stalks onto the cart, and then you transport them to the mills. You have to unload them, of course. And then you place that sugar cane into the crushers, basically to extract the juice. Okay, where they boil it and they make this molasses, this sort of brown sugar that comes out of it. Okay, so it's a very intense, labor-intensive process. But as you could predict, because they're underpaid, because they're a cheap labor force again, they're underpaid. Eventually, you're going to see discontent and disenchantment expressed by the Japanese workers and other workers too. So this will lead to movements to protest their conditions, their labor conditions, as well as their exploitation in terms of, wage. Okay, so this is what you'll see. You'll see the Japanese becoming quite militant in their demands for better work conditions, higher wages, to putting an end to their exploitation and mistreatment by the owners and the lunas in charge. And you would see a series of riots and strikes happening in the islands during the early 20th century. And by the way, later Asian groups would come, like Filipinos, and they would form this alliance, this coalition, right? Filipinos and Japanese as being the leaders of these strikes. And of course, it deserves mention that other groups, ethnic groups working there, like the Puerto Ricans and Portuguese, are shoulder to shoulder in this coalition. There's always going to be strike breakers that go against this movement, but in other words, it is still a tense environment there in among the plantation workers. But you see their demands being met in most cases, but it's through violence and even mayhem and death. Right here, you see 17 dead in the strike riot. Filipino sugar plantation workers strike. Right. Hawaii sugar plantations are burning. So, sometimes you see the intervention of, the government here. All right. So, it's important to note this, that similar to the Chinese case where they didn't just, submit to their oppression, so too we see that with the Japanese and Filipinos and other labor groups in Hawaii. Now, eventually, what you're going to see happen is American business interest trying to attract labor, to the American West Coast. And as I mentioned, they're going to be found in the country of Japan itself, but also they're going to go to Hawaii and trying to recruit some labor, especially those who are discontent with the conditions in Hawaii. So you see, following their recruitment efforts, around 34,000 Japanese workers leaving Hawaii for the mainland. This is going to happen between 1900 through 1907, and we'll discuss why 1907 specifically. But again, these were Japanese workers arriving in the continental U.S. They're going to enter as agricultural workers predominantly. Two-thirds of them, in fact, are going to be farm workers, agricultural workers. And there is a distinct difference here when it comes to the work patterns between the plantations in Hawaii and the seasonal agribusiness of the West. Both are very harsh in their work conditions. But while the laborers in Hawaii, the sugar plantations, basically stayed put, they were stationary. Those working in the fields of, say, California or Washington states, they were radically migratory. These are migrant workers. They're not stationary. Rather, they're working according to, the season and the harvest. So in many cases, you had seasonal crops, for example, which had to be harvested for a period of, let's say, 2 to 6 weeks, maybe 2 months. And once that job is finished, you go to the next location, which could be a different part of the U.S. West. So you could migrate from Yakima Valley in Washington all the way down to Coachella in Southern California. So you can imagine them just migrating through different parts of the agricultural region, San Joaquin Valley, for example, and harvesting these crops and never having a stationary life, right, as opposed to the plantation life. So you can kind of see the effect this is going to have on the formation of community. You won't see a definitive place of settlement for the Japanese. You got to contrast this with, say, immigrant flow coming from, let's say, Europe, say Italy, or Jewish or Polish. When they work in the industrial cities, they form these ethnic neighborhoods in Chicago, ethnic neighborhoods in New York, right? The Irish neighborhood, the Italian neighborhood, the Jewish neighborhoods. You don't really see that with the Asians in the West Coast. Because the earlier Chinese working on the railroad, it's similarly migratory and not stationary, and you see that, of course, with the Japanese. That's not to say they don't have places like, of course, Chinatown, a few blocks of San Francisco, right, or even Japantown, maybe a few blocks or one road, but it's still not the same as those ethnic neighborhoods in other industrial cities. But one thing we have to acknowledge is we don't have that skewed gender ratio, that high in gender imbalance, as we discussed, when you compare it with the Chinese. In fact, if you look at these pictures, you see families here. And it brings up actually a distinction here when it comes to family formation that's now more possible with the Japanese. And that'll be the Issei. These are the first immigrants coming over, the first generations. And those children of the first generation, American born, and therefore American citizens, they're going to be the Nisei, the second generation. And as we'll discuss when we cover World War II and Japanese internment, when they're put in concentration camps after Pearl Harbor, we're going to see that the vast majority of those interned are Nisei, they're American citizens. But they'll be basically denied their constitutional rights because of war hysteria that happens. We'll discuss that very soon. Now, one thing I alluded to earlier was the fact that, in contrast to the Chinese, who could not be or could not expect support from their home country, when it came to the Japanese migrating to the West, because of the Meiji Restoration, Japan became a powerful country in just a very short span of time. In fact, by the turn of the 20th century, they were pretty much in league with much of the great European empires, the European powers. They actually defeated Russia, the Russian Empire, in the Russo-Japanese War. It's the first time an Asian country beat a European country in the modern world. And indeed, as I made mention before, they'd be so good at modernizing that they become the most highly industrialized area in Asia, in the Pacific region. And indeed, they become an empire themselves. They'd be mimicking the European powers in their quest to dominate and colonize all of Asia during World War II. And of course, that would end it with, especially with the atomic bombs that you may be aware of. Okay, so going back to the immigrant workers, the whole point here is that they could rely on the Japanese state, the Japanese government, to express their grievances due to the discriminatory laws and prejudice they experienced in the United States. Okay, so this is important to note because, as we'll discuss, it's going to figure prominently in the negotiation between the U.S. government and the Japanese state, the Japanese government, when they decide to bar or put an end to Japanese immigration. Now, I did mention earlier that the initial wave of the Japanese workers for the agribusinesses in the West, when it came to their working life, it was radically migratory. They could never be truly stationary. But one thing we do see after a few years is that the Japanese worker wanted to transition from being a migratory worker towards that of an independent landowner. Okay, and if not just a landowner, at least becoming a tenant farmer. for an American landowner, right? So they, in other words, wanted to leave behind the ranks of agribusiness, be more of an independent worker. In fact, they really didn't like to join labor unions. They preferred a more settled way of life rather than migrating according to the seasons, and they're attracted to the possibility of family life. And in fact, some farmers who are still bachelors, and they may have been older, right? Some of them were in their 30s or 40s. They were eligible to summon wives in Japan through this institution called pitcher brides, as it was called. Okay, and basically they would have it as broker, if you will, kind of like a dating service we see today, right? But a broker in Japan actually trying to arrange marriages, and they did this through pitchers. So the Japanese worker would send his pitcher through the broker, and then he would in turn see potential brides, and they would arrange a marriage that way. So this is long distance, right? And there's stories and diaries and so forth. In fact, there was a movie. I don't know how good it was, but there was a movie made, decades ago about pitcher brides. But oftentimes in these diaries, these women express their disappointment at seeing their husband because the husband didn't use a authentic photograph. It was actually a lot older than he said. Sometimes he didn't have the amount of land that he claimed to have, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is the poignant story of pitcher brides. But besides from being an interesting cultural institution for the Japanese, this is obviously a way to form families, right? So you have more of a family formation, especially compared to the Chinese. Now, one thing also distinct about the Japanese is not only family formation and not only having the resource of their state government, the Japanese state government, right, to protect them in America, but also their desire, for the most part, to become more assimilated to American culture. And how is this done? You can see it in this picture, right? Well, here you have the newly arrived brides, right? But then you see Japanese men dressed in Western suits. So that's what they do in their attempt to assimilate to American culture. They wear American clothing. They certainly learn how to speak English. They would teach the Nisei English. In fact, many of the Nisei would not know Japanese, the native tongue of their parents. They did things like adopt Christianity. They sent their children to American schools, simultaneous to the Japanese schools that they set up. But they're trying to counter, in other words, this stereotype of the Asians being unassimilable, right? They can't assimilate. It's being uncivilized. These are the stereotypes that were attached to the earlier Chinese. And they were aware of this, okay? They were aware of the extreme discrimination and prejudice that the Chinese faced before them, and they tried to prevent that from happening. But despite this effort to assimilate, you do see numerous cases of discrimination, prejudice, legal statutes passed to circumscribe the movement of the Japanese, right? And even racist violence perpetrated against, again, the nativists and even the white working class who were there and who viewed the Japanese pretty much as a menace. Okay, so these incidents paralleled the oppression of the Chinese. You see segregation, again, racist legislation, even race riots that happen, white politicians becoming virulently anti-Japanese. And got to say that this is part and parcel of the Issei experience in America. I'm saying Issei because the Nisei were still young. But if you were an Issei, you had to deal with this stuff, right, in your daily life.